Handwerker with us today. Jeff and I had the privilege of working together when he was a member of the board of DC Appleseed and I was on the staff. And he has been a behind the scenes supporter of Capitol Hill Village since I lured him.
It
Suckered him
didn't
into
take
it.
much to lure me, though. There.
But I think, as folks know, DC Appleseed has been one of the leaders in DC from a legal front in protecting DC autonomy, and that has taken different kind of forms over the years. But right now, as you know, there are very specific threats to DC and DC home rule, and that's what Jeff is here to talk about today. So I know that most of you are familiar with kind of home rule in general. But maybe Jeff, if you can just give us like a, like a the
The 10-second
elevator
version?
version,
Yeah, the elevator
of
version of it?
elevator speech
Sure.
version of home rule, and then we can go from there.
Yes. No, absolutely. And hi, everyone. It's great to be here today and to talk to you. And I was mentioning to Judy before we started, this is a really smart group, and we intend this to be a dialogue. So as you all know, the Home Rule Act was passed in the early 70s, and it gives DC autonomy over most things related to municipal rule. It allows DC to have a council and a mayor, and to pass laws related to the district, but that power is limited. Any law passed by the council, as I'm sure you know, has to go through a congressional review process before it can go into effect. During that process, the law can be blocked through a joint resolution of both houses of Congress. That has happened fairly recently, in fact, with the criminal justice reforms in DC. Those were blocked in 2023 through this process. The review period for most laws is 30 days. For criminal statutes and criminal procedure statutes, it's 60 days. And the Home Rule Act also prohibits the DC Council from enacting laws that would do certain things. So, for example, DC can't impose taxes on property owned by US or state governments. There's the commuter tax restrictions, so DC can't impose a tax on people who work in the district but live elsewhere. As a Maryland resident, sometimes I like that provision. DC can't pass a law that lends credit for private projects. There's other things too. You're probably familiar with the height restriction on buildings. Federal buildings, DC cannot change that by DC law or change the composition of courts in DC. Congress also, and this is really important for where we're going, Congress retains authority, significant authority over the DC budget. So, for example, the DC Council has to ensure that its annual budget is balanced in light of projected revenues. The operating budget going back before 2012, at least, was approved through a federal appropriations process. But there was a law in 2012 that allows the DC government to enact its own budgets, but it's subject to congressional review and oversight. And Congress does, unfortunately, exercise that oversight fairly routinely in the federal budgeting process. They will very commonly attach riders to budget bills that restrict what the DC government can do. Some examples include that the DC cannabis market, for instance, cannot be taxed. That was a specific budget rider about 10 years ago, and it's continued ever since. The ban on use of taxpayer funds for abortions applies to DC as well under an amendment to one of the budget bills. So there are examples where Congress has asserted authority over the DC budget. In light of the current environment, it's important, I think, for us as we think through this discussion we're going to have today, to think about the powers of the president. So it's very clear that Congress has power over DC in terms of its ability to review the DC Council laws and its ability to restrict certain types of laws from moving forward in the first place in DC. The president also has some powers over DC, not many, but some, and they're specifically enumerated. So for example, the Home Rule Act permits the president to take control over the DC Police Department if the president determines that there's an emergency situation in DC that justifies it. That's for a 48-hour period. It could be longer if the president notifies Congress in writing that it needs to be longer. And it could even conceivably go for months if the president exercises his discretion in that way. The president also controls the DC National Guard, which for January 6th was a big deal because I'm sure you've seen that the National Guard was delayed in coming to the Capitol, and that was under the president's control. The president also appoints, lawyers for the district, such as the U.S. Attorney. So the president does have some power here in addition to Congress. And so that is a good maybe place to transition to why we're here. The President Trump is now fully in charge, and the Republicans control both houses of Congress. There was a bill introduced last year that's reintroduced this year called aptly named, I suppose, the Bowser Act, that would repeal home rule altogether. At minimum, though, there are risks that the president and Congress, in collaboration, could seek to retain, even absent enacting a full repeal. There is risk that they will scale back the autonomy of the DC Council and the DC government, exercising more aggressive oversight, particularly over the budget and over the police department. And what we've been tasked with doing is to evaluate what the president's authorities might be, specifically with respect, if the president were to assert that there's an emergency in DC because, you could make it up. There's too much migrant crime. The murder rate is too high. What is the scope of the president's power to control the DC Police Department? What is the scope of Congress's power to control the DC budget? What are the differences between DC as a territory of the United States and states? For instance, and I'm going to a little bit of history that a lot of you probably know, but when the Constitution was enacted, there was consideration given to including a clause in the district provision of the Constitution, which is entitled Article 1, Section 8, that would have said if the district population equals or exceeds the population of the lowest population state, DC, the district will become a state. Like, there was consideration of putting that expressly in the Constitution. It wasn't. It's in the Federalist Papers, actually, that was the intent of the framers. But that didn't happen. DC's population didn't get to that size until around the Civil War. And by that point, the politics of the country had changed, and there was no political imperative to make DC a state. That history is important today because DC's population is larger than some states, but states under federal law get greater benefits in certain instances than DC does as a territory. There's some inequity in terms of, for example, COVID funding was disproportionately lower to DC as a territory than to states of similar or less size than DC. So one of the things that we're looking at, and this is particularly concerning given the current state of affairs with the government, is what are the differences between being considered a territory and a state? When does Congress draw that distinction in law? And how does that affect DC's rights and interests?
So Jeff, can you explain, like, how would you use that argument in the current, in what you're imagining might be a current or an upcoming situation?
Yeah, it's a great question, Judy. So if the intent of the Constitution was that DC's rights, whether one of the problems, let me back up. When the litigation was brought a few years ago, seeking to give DC voting representation in the House and the Senate, one of the arguments that was made is that DC, there's a substantive right, fundamental right to vote. And moreover, DC has similar status to states, and this history demonstrates that the intent of the framers was that when DC reached a certain size, they would be considered proportionate to a state. And it's fundamentally unfair that people could reside in the district and not have voting representation in Congress, but people who lived in other states and traveled abroad and lived abroad, but were citizens of and residents of a state other than DC, would be allowed, would have voting representation. It's just, why should it be that if you move to Europe, you continue to have your voting rights in the US, but if you move to the district, you lose them? So that argument was made and lost. And the reason it was lost is because the court construed the Constitution narrowly to say that voting rights only apply to citizens of residents of states. And it uses the word state explicitly. And so they rejected the historical argument over that textual argument. So what we want to understand is, how does that distinction between DC as a territory versus states affect the rights that DC has under various federal laws? Because there are some federal laws that apply only to states and other federal laws that apply to states and territories. And in some instances, DC is considered equivalent to a state in certain laws. In other laws, DC is viewed as a territory, as something subordinate to a state. And we want to develop, whether there's any rationality to those distinctions and whether there's any kind of arbitrary, inconsistent treatment arguments that can be made, especially when you think about what this administration might do. Right? If they have control over the DC budget, if they have control over how DC regulates crime, and other traditionally municipal obligations. So that's what we're looking at. We're looking just to see, is there any inconsistency? And if there is inconsistency, it could help if we need to argue that the government is acting in a arbitrary way.
And can you briefly share what some of the other firms, what other firms are involved in this sort of whole process, and if they have a particular piece?
There's a lot of firms involved, just to be clear. Hunton and Williams is involved. Hogan and Hart's Hogan Levels is involved. That's how old I am. Hogan and
Yeah.
Hart's. Hogan Levels is involved. Covington. There's a long list
Yeah.
of
And
firms.
each one has a piece of this particular issue of the states and territories, or are they looking at
There's
different things
no,
altogether?
there's all different legal questions. I'll run through a list. Hang on.
Okay.
Um, First issue, federalization of DC's police force. And the summary of the issue is that currently the DC police force is funded through the DC budget, and the chief of the police reports to the DC mayor.
Mhm.
The president, as I mentioned earlier, under the Home Rule Act, can take control of the police force in DC if he determines that special conditions of an emergency nature exist, which require the use of the DC police force for federal purposes. So the question that one firm is looking at is, do DC officials or DC residents have any legal defenses if the president or the Congress takes control over the DC police? And what types of actions might exist in law to delay or prevent a federal takeover of the DC police force? Then on the territory or state issue, which I alluded to, there's some unfair treatment. So I mentioned the COVID law. So in March of 2020, Congress passed the COVID relief bill, which gave DC a disproportionately lower amount of funding than states that are similarly sized to DC, such as Wyoming or Vermont. Congress classified DC under that law as a territory and not a state. And so the legal question is, under what circumstances can Congress treat DC as a territory? And when must Congress treat DC as a state? And there are differences, as I alluded to, among laws. There are some laws, like the Medicaid program, for example, treats DC as a state. So what's the difference? And the reasons for that are, if there are differences, you could have situations where DC is discriminated against, as in the COVID example. Another question that a firm is researching is executive power. So in particular, and you can see why we might be looking at this, what power does the president have under the Home Rule Act? And are there other federal or DC laws that give the president unique powers related to DC? And an example of that is the National Guard. DC's National Guard is the only National Guard of any territory or state that reports to the president. So that's unique to DC. Are there other examples of that? And then last, or not last, but maybe most important, budget autonomy. This is a huge one, in my view. Under what circumstances can Congress or the president repeal or reduce DC's budget autonomy? And so there is a firm that is looking into that. We're also looking, and this is a broader issue, and this is one where Arnold and Porter is going to be deeply involved because of our experience with voter ID. There is a chance that Congress could impose voter ID requirements on DC. And our firm was successful in getting the Pennsylvania voter ID law struck down a few years ago. So that's something we're going to be focused in on. So those are just some examples. This is an important time. Let me close my opening comments with this. This is an important time and a volatile time for the district. There is a perception, which is inaccurate, from the Congress and the president, that DC is inefficiently run. It's not well run as a city. And because of that, there is a real desire to usurp control, take control back over DC municipal decision making. And, the initial Home Rule Act was actually intended to relieve Congress of burdens that Congress at that time didn't want to deal with. Now, apparently, they have time on their hands and want to take control of DC again. And we're looking, the bigger picture of this is we're looking at ways to use the courts and other advocacy channels to try to mitigate that risk for the district.
Great. Thank you so much for explaining all that, Jeff. So we'd love to open it up for questions. I think, I don't know, I can't see everybody on my screen. So the easiest thing to do, if you go down, if you hover over the bottom of your screen or the top, you should see a raise hand button. And if you raise your hand, then you pop to the top of the line, and then we can see you. The other thing you can do, if you wave your hand and somebody sees you waving your hand and wants to unmute and say so-and-so's waving their hand, we can use that too. And you can also put in the chat that either you want to speak or you can put your question in the chat and we'll call on you that way. So can everybody find their raise hand button? It looks like, oh, there you go. I see Barbara found it.
Yep.
All right.
I don't see the raise. I'm sorry, don't see the raise.
You don't see the raise hand? All right. Well, just if you who's speaking there?
Oh, this is Shirley speaking.
Oh, Shirley. Okay. Well, we'll put you next then. We'll talk Barbara and then Shirley. How about that?
Thank you.
Hi, great comments, an incredibly interesting and important time. Could you talk a little bit about what might happen to local schools and education and the ability of
Yes.
DEI and just everything you can imagine?
Oh my God, yeah. So thank you for that question, Barbara. I actually should have mentioned this. With what is going on at the federal level in terms of potentially scaling back the Department of Education, scaling back the EPA, for just two examples. There are others, and the scaling, obviously the scaling of DEI across the board. There is risk here. So if the federal policy, let's say DC passed a clean water bill for the district, for the Anacostia River, and that's probably where you're going. Congress, under the Home Rule Act, theoretically, can override that through a joint resolution. And the fact that there is now going to be less federal regulation than there has been presents a need for states, and I use that term in air quotes, for states to fill the gap. And you're going to see states like blue states like California, New York, et cetera, being aggressive in regulating to protect the environment, to protect education. DC has less autonomy potentially to do that than other similarly situated states. And that's part of the big picture of that research project that I mentioned about the difference between a state and a territory. And that's definitely included. Like what we're thinking about is whether DC could be disadvantaged if DC policy is that we want to promote education, we want to promote DEI, we want to promote critical race theory. If the federal government is prohibiting that, what rights do we have? Whereas other states, if an independent state would be free to enact their own law, right? I mean, it's not expressly under the Constitution, the federal government has specifically enumerated powers. Education is not among them. So in the absence of something explicit in the Constitution, states are free to regulate, in the public interest. And that may not apply to DC to the same degree as it would apply to New York or California. And that's something we want to try to pursue.
Great.
Thank you.
Really good point. Thank you, Barbara.
Shirley. Thank you. And then I'll go, there's a couple of questions in the comments. that I'll
Thank you.
raise.
This one of my suggestions may sound like off the wall, but it occurred to me when I was listening to you about the dual residency, residents of a state who actually reside overseas, but they maintain their voting rights.
Right.
Okay. Is there any, and this is there any exploration at all about us becoming dual residents in let's say, a state that has voting rights, so that perhaps, since we're being treated differently as a territory, that's one question. Is there any possibility of that we would retain our DC residency, but be dual residents, if you will? Another question has to do with the territories. Frequently, the comparison of territories is made. For example, and I don't know if this is true, if Puerto Rico is a territory, but frequently
is.
said they do not pay income taxes. And have we looked at the differences between our treatment and other territorials to compile that list of differences that pushes us towards statehood? That's my second question. And then third, is there any benefit? I believe that a number of Congress people who are supporting this, perhaps for decent reasons, or they believe that they don't know the district is in trouble. Is there any benefit or interest in an outreach where they would meet citizens or go through neighborhoods and actually see what the district is and who lives there and the services that are provided? Anyway, different areas.
All really good. So let me do them in reverse order.
Thank you.
So on the third question, absolutely. So the advocacy strategies here are not limited to litigation options. We are absolutely committed. There are strategies in terms of interacting with the DC government as well as the federal government and trying to do education. All you need in the Senate here is 40 votes to block something. So there is a strategy that could work in blocking a repeal of the Home Rule Act. So I feel good about that, and DC Appleseed is working through those channels as well. Your second question, I should have written it down.
The second question to do with territorial differences, like Puerto Rico doesn't pay taxes.
Yes, I think that is a fantastic idea, and I'm going to suggest that to Vanessa. It was not on the list of topics, but it should be. It's a really good point. It's not just discrimination or differences between DC and states. It's the difference among territories to the extent that there are differences, and there are some. Puerto Rico does have preferred status. You're 100% right in terms of taxation. So that too is worth exploring. Then the first question about dual residency. The trick there, I guess, is can people really afford to do that? Like some people, sure, might have residency in the district and in a neighboring state, but I don't know that that's a viable option for most people in the district. If they could do it, yes, it would make a difference in terms of voting representation. I'm fortunate. I live in the district, but I also do have a residence in another state. But not everybody can do that. And I don't think they should have to do that either. But yes, that is an option. One of the arguments that was strongly made, as I mentioned, is this Overseas Voting Act is entirely inconsistent with the way DC is treated for voting rights purposes. It is 100% inconsistent, and the court just blew it off. Yes, go ahead, Shirley.
Yeah, if I can. I think that's from left field, and it was based kind of on the assumption that the people who are hightailing it to Europe and having a good old time, that's probably a small percentage of the population anyway. But that one was kind of out of left field. Thank you.
You're welcome.
But doesn't it also apply to the military?
It does. Yeah, it does. And I think, by the way, just to be clear, I think that's appropriate. The court interpreted DC Appleseed's argument as saying that the rights of the military and others who are overseas to vote was somehow unconstitutional. And that's not what DC Appleseed was arguing at all. DC Appleseed believes that that law is appropriate and good policy. It's just that it also should mean it's just fundamentally inconsistent and unfair that somebody could choose, who lives in New Jersey, who could choose to live in London and would still have voting representation, but if they moved to the district, they wouldn't.
Mhm.
That was the point. And the court just never really accepted that.
All right, so we have two comments in the chat, and one of them I think suggests rightly, maybe as we wrap up, we can talk about best ways for residents to plug in to defending democracy. So we can have, so we'll bracket that for the moment. But Kristen, and then I'll come to Bill. Kristen asked, can you briefly speak about the governing system that existed prior to home rule?
I certainly can. It was a long and storied history. Going back to the founding, actually, there was initially a commission that was appointed by Congress. That was in place through the late 1700s into the 1800s. Then in the 1800s, there was an elected council for a period of time and an appointed mayor, again, appointed by Congress. For most of the 1800s, there was an elected council and an elected mayor. All the way through to 1967, that was the general approach. There was either an elected mayor or an appointed mayor during that window of time. Really, things started to change for home rule with the Voting Rights Act in 1965. And let me just be transparent here for a minute. What happened is DC is the first majority minority district territory in the country.
Mm-hmm.
And when DC, I mentioned earlier that DC achieved the size of the smallest states around 1860. What was happening at that point? Civil War. There was segregation, and there was racism. And because of that, there was no imperative for DC to get autonomy. And that situation continued through the 60s. Then the Voting Rights Act was passed in 1965. And from that point until the early 70s, there were about 6 attempts to give DC home rule that didn't quite get through. But then President Nixon enacted it in the early 70s. Before that point, it was a combination of congressional appointed governors/mayors and elected councils, but it was it was congressionally controlled. There was a little bit of flexibility at various points in time to elect a mayor and to elect a council, but it actually went back and forth depending on who was in charge of the Congress. So there was a series of changes throughout the 1800s and 1900s until 1965.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
And then Bill I see Bill's hand up, Bill Sisolak. And then I see Nan wrote a comment in the, or no, it was just a comment. Okay.
Yeah,
So
they
Bill?
keep residency in the state from where they are when they go.
Yeah.
That's true.
Yep. Bill, do you want to unmute? Looks like, all right, well, we'll come back to Bill. Okay, Carol, there's another question in the chat. Wouldn't the doctrine of preemption prevent states or DC or territories from passing legislation that is contrary to federal law?
Yes. So there are several types of preemption. The one that's alluded to in that question is called conflict preemption. So if the federal law says X, a state can't enact a law that says not X. But there's a lot of gray in that. I mean, there's also something called obstacle preemption as well, which is that a state cannot pass a law that would be an obstacle to the achievement of a federal goal in a federal statute. There is a presumption in the law against preemption. So judges are trained to look at state laws liberally. And if there's any way to construe the state law as not being in conflict with the federal law, that's the way courts should go. So preemption is the exception and not the rule. But it's out there. So yeah, if the federal law says we must have dirty waters, then the state cannot enact a law that says, no, we need clean waters. But you're never going to have a law that's quite like that. And so where a federal law is silent or ambiguous, states are allowed, and indeed the Constitution requires that those rights are reserved to the states, period. So there's Amendment 10 of the Constitution says that any power that is not expressly delegated to the federal government is reserved to the states and the people. And so Congress exercises its specified powers, its enumerated powers through the legislation that it enacts. To the extent that Congress hasn't acted clearly on something, a state can supplement what Congress has done. So there would have to be, to Carol's question, to prevent a state from enacting a law, and by state here, I'm talking state in particular rather than a territory. To prevent a state from enacting a law, it would have to be in direct conflict with federal statute or create an obstacle to the achievement of a federal statute's objectives. And that would be analyzed with a presumption against preemption.
Thank you for that question. And then, Nan, do you want to speak your question? I'm happy to read it for you. Nan's on mute.
Is there a movement afoot to relieve us from paying federal taxes until we get statehood?
Yes.
Not that I am aware of. Not
Have you
that I'm
heard about
aware of.
anything?
That would be more of a, that's not something I think we could argue. I want to think about this actually, whether we could make a legal argument to that effect.
Well, the acting attorney general as well would not have our best interest at heart, since he is an election denier.
Mm-hmm.
And he was I don't know if he was in charge, but he was part of the effort to stop the steal.
Mm-hmm.
And he has no experience as a prosecutor.
Got it.
Is
Got
there?
it. I have not heard of anything, but I can certainly check.
Mm-hmm.
I would certainly support it.
Yeah, I know we're talking about it recently.
No taxation without representation. It's on our license plates.
That's right.
And also, while I was in the military, I didn't have to pay DC tax until I retired. They have what they call a home of record. So where you join the military, that's where you keep your home of record. And in New Jersey, I was exempt from paying state tax while I was active duty military, and then didn't have to start paying DC taxes until I retired. Then you pay taxes where you're living.
Fascinating. I did not know that. That's interesting.
Yeah, well, let's
Also inconsistent with the way DC residents are treated.
That's right. And so maybe we put that on our list of things to, like, possible actions that we can.
My list is growing.
Yeah.
So this call is extremely helpful.
Okay. I see Chris Healy has a question. I don't know. Did Bill go off, or did he leave the call? I'm not sure. I'll ask Mary.
Can you hear me?
Oh, now we can hear you. Yeah.
We can hear you.
Well, I left the call, but unintentionally, my iPad ran out of power.
Oh, okay.
So I'm now over on my iPhone. Vera is upstairs on our desktop, so you probably see her also.
Okay.
And I don't see how to raise a hand here, but I did it.
That's okay. You're
manually.
fine.
Okay.
You got the floor.
Okay. Vera and I have been in the district since 1967, well before home rule, obviously. And unfortunately, Jeffrey, the answer, I was listening to your answer about what happened before home rule. And my iPad died at exactly the point I think I wanted to hear your answer. Because I have this fantasy of Marjorie Taylor Greene down at the Office of Planning having to hand out building permits, stuff like that. But seriously, and I don't think this will happen. I'm really, I think some things may happen. They may take over the police. They're not going to take over the city government at that level of detail. But let's say that were to happen. Who runs the bureaucracy, the day-to-day departments of the district government from Congress?
They'd have to assign somebody. It's not clear.
Wow. Okay.
There's nobody who's vested with that authority right now.
Right. My other point quickly, I really appreciate all the work you and the other firms are doing on this. And I hate to sound snarky, but the reality, as we see in so many other instances at this moment, is have you thought through what happens if you have to go to court, district, circuits, because we know what the Supreme Court is going to do. I hate to sound pessimistic, but I think all your work may well be irrelevant, useless, because we know how they're going to vote on issues like, for example, comparing us with Puerto Rico, where Vera and I go regularly. We were just there for a couple of weeks in January. So what? I mean, you can make the perfect logical and legal argument, and you have, and others have.
Yeah,
It's irrelevant once it gets to this Supreme Court.
it's possible. Let me play the optimist devil's advocate.
Please, I'd like to be more optimistic. I'm just not.
Yeah, I mean, so you're alluding to the fact that the current Supreme Court consists of 6 conservative judges.
Of course.
Here's what it means to be a conservative judge in this context. It means that you are a federalist. Federalists promote states' rights over federal control. That's their ideology. So when you think about a Justice Gorsuch or a Chief Justice Roberts or even Justice Thomas, they are pro-states' rights on everything. So when there is, I'll use an extreme example. Look at Dobbs. The Justice Alito's decision in Dobbs is that the states should decide what abortion rights should be on a state-by-state basis over a federal decree. So that's the way conservative justices, if they are principled, would look at the issues. So if we were to go to the current Supreme Court with an argument that the federal government is usurping authority that state and local governments retain under the Constitution, that argument would have a good chance of winning with this Supreme Court.
Well, I have to respectfully disagree because they would not look at the District of Columbia in that logical, legal way. They would look at us at an 80 or 90% Democratic. They would look at it through a political lens.
So you may be right. Yeah.
Well, Bill, I think the other thing is that and I'm going to read here what Linda suggests, which I think has some weight as well, is that the more people learn, like if you hear these arguments and actually begin to sway public opinion on some of these things, right? That there is, it doesn't change the way the court votes right now, but it could change the reaction to that.
Yeah, and I'm reading the comments, and I hear you. Some justices are not principled. I get it. I get it.
And I think, and Bill, accurately, I mean, this is what a lot of us are concerned about. I'd like to go to Chris. So Chris has her hand up, and I'd like to
go ahead. Go ahead, Chris.
You're on mute,
Yeah,
Chris. Yeah.
okay. Thanks very much. And I'm sorry I was late. I'm coming in, and so I didn't hear the beginning of your conversation, but I was hoping, and I want to encourage, or I'm very glad to hear that there's so much work going on, and I want to encourage it. And despite what we might think the end result will be in front of the Supreme Court, all this work has to happen. But my question was, you've talked about preemption. What's the current state of the law in terms of the federal government compelling states and localities to do something conditioned on getting a federal grant or federal funds?
Thank you for that. So there is a Supreme Court case called South Carolina versus Dole. I think it's President Trump's favorite case, although he probably doesn't know what it is.
Of course not.
What that case held, so back in the day, South Carolina set a drinking age of 18, and the federal government's priority was that the drinking age should be 21. And so the federal government attached a condition to highway funding in all the states. It said you have to adopt a 21-year-old drinking age in order to get highway funding. And that went all the way up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court upheld it for the following reason. And this is nuanced, so I want to be clear on this. The funding restriction was directly related to the policy initiative that the government was trying to execute.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not like they were saying, we're going to take away your educational funding if you don't adopt a drinking age. They were saying, look, we think there's a safety issue on the highways if young people are drinking to excess and then getting behind the wheel. So we're going to tie your highway funding to establishing a drinking age that will, in our view, mitigate the risk of accidents. Right? So there's a direct relationship between the funding that is being restricted and the restriction.
Right. So how does that affect like the Black Lives Matter thing recently?
Well, that's a case we're involved with.
Oh,
You know, so I don't know if I can comment or not, but I'll give you, especially in this where it's being taped. But here's what I would say. If the funds that are being withheld, where this comes up most often today is with the grant funding that's being pulled back or threatened to be pulled back. Like, I'll give you one that I'm not involved with, which is maybe more, or my firm's not involved with. So the transgender matter in Maine, let's use that as an example. So President Trump has said to states that if you continue to allow biological men to play in women's sports, I'm going to take away various funding from the state. In order for that to be upheld under the current law, the funding that is restricted needs to directly relate to the federal policy. And if it's like, we're going to take away all of your funding for the state for like emergency relief, if you have a hurricane in your state, we're going to take away FEMA funding, for instance, that would be unconstitutional because there's no relationship between the funding that's being restricted and the policy initiative of the executive branch that they're trying to enforce. So maybe that's the best way I can answer it, is the current state of the law is federal funding can only be restricted if the restriction is directly related to a federal goal that is related to the funding that's being restricted.
And of course, there must be some other nuance that has to be the federal law, not the pronouncement of the president.
Yeah. So there's a statute, there's a separation of powers issue too. You're 100% right, Christine. So the president can't just declare what federal law is, notwithstanding what Governor Mills. He's not the federal law. So federal law has to be enacted by Congress and signed into law by the president. That's basic governance. So, but it's those types of laws. You are correct, Christine. Like if it's done by executive order, there are other arguments that could be made as well.
Mm.
That exceeds executive power to do unilaterally.
Great, thank you.
You're welcome.
I wonder, are there any other questions for Jeff around the, before we get into how we might want to respond? What are our non-legal or non-litigation related strategies? Okay, so Carol asked, given the South Carolina decision on immunity, what could
Supreme
be
Court
done
decision.
to what's that? Well, say, why
Supreme
don't you
Court.
explain it? Because not everybody understands what the
Yeah, so last term there was a decision on presidential immunity that gives the president broad immunity for acts taken under the authority as president. And qualified immunity for acts taken not as president, but that relate to executive powers that derive from his executive role. And it was a broad decision that immunized the president from prosecution. So I think the question here is, if the administration chose not to enforce a court decision, like if the court came down against them and the administration said, we're not going to enforce it, what could be done? Nothing could be done to the president in his official capacity, but it would create a significant constitutional crisis if a president ignored a decision of the Supreme Court.
does that include impeachment? But that's not considered, or that's not considered criminal, so that wouldn't. It's only criminal prosecution, right?
That's correct. I mean, but it might be a crime, depending on the circumstances. It could be contempt of court.
Mm-hmm.
So impeachment is the only remedy for a president's criminal acts in the Constitution. Believe it or not.
Other questions, and Mary, I'm going to ask maybe to put us all in gallery so we can, if we can take Jeff out of the spotlight if he wants to.
I
join
love the
the
spotlight. But...
Yeah, I mean, let's join a whole broader conversation and talk about maybe folks have thoughts about what are some of the actions that we can take as private citizens, as residents of the district, or others that we can to address these issues that we're dealing with. Let's see. I can share one that I have heard. There's a group now called Free DC, the Free DC Project. Free DC was created in response to the overturning of the criminal code changes a couple of years ago. And they are a grassroots organization organizing by ward to try to increase the number of people willing and able to participate in civil resistance. Their work is premised in part on the work of Erica Chenoweth, who has analyzed civil resistance movements throughout the world, Arab Spring and others. And her research changed her from believing in violent resistance to believing in civil resistance, because they tend to be the movements that are the most successful more of the time. And they are working from the theory that what you need is 3.5% of a population to initiate a movement, a civil resistance movement, because that number, that many people, starts to bring in others who feel protected by the presence of others. So if you get it sort of like the early adopters, if you get so many people buying, wearing those ear pods sticking out of their ears, then, like enough people will think, well, that looks normal and I can do that too. But the idea is that, people who are more vulnerable or more risk averse, or for whatever reason, or maybe positioned in such a way they can't participate, they will gain strength from having, when there's 3.5% of the population, when they can, when they know that, that you can start to bring those people in. So anyway, I know Free DC is doing events all over the city. There is an orientation that they're doing next week. I think it's the 11th, maybe if somebody else knows, on the 11th, but you can look them up. They are one of the organizations specifically located in DC, that's working on the DC home rule issues.
The orientation is the 11th, 6 to 8 at the Northeast Neighborhood Library on 7th Street Northeast.
There's also a Stand Up for
Thank you.
Science demonstration tomorrow going on in the mall, so national demonstration. So I know it's not related to DC, but it's somebody said in the chats, just participating and getting your voices heard, and I think we're all hoping it's going to be a really big one, but we'll see.
Who's organizing that one, Barbara?
It's an organization called Stand Up for Science.
Oh, Stand Up for Science. Okay.
Stand Up for Science. So I think mostly around NIH and all the budget cuts.
Okay. Yeah, Nan, go ahead. Oh, yeah, you got.
Okay, there's going to be a meeting with Brian Schwab. At this, that's one of the events that Alyssa Silverman has set up at the Southwest Library on March 15th from 1:30 to 3:30.
And what's
Saturday, March 15th.
what is the focus of that?
DC voting rights. Yeah, she's also trying to set up a meeting with this new MAGA Attorney General too, but that hasn't been set up yet. Where's the protest tomorrow?
Stand Up for Science?
I thought it was at Freedom Plaza, or is it at the Lincoln Memorial?
The only thing I have on their website is the mall, so I don't know where it is. I don't know.
I will, if I find out, I'll send it out to, if this group is interested, I can just send to the email to this group.
Yes,
Are there
please.
any other ways, Jeff, are you aware of any ways that we can support, we can support DC Appleseed obviously directly, which is, oh, there, the mayor's got the website on there, up there too in the chat.
Yeah, there's a network that DC Appleseed is forming that's going to be a coalition of organizations, and I can definitely loop Capitol Hill Village into that if it's useful.
What if, are folks interested in that? Yeah, I see Shirley. Did you have a question, Shirley? Or you have you're unmute there, yeah. Oh, you're still on mute, Shirley. Yeah.
This is kind of the soft power thing. We all have a lot of friends, family, acquaintances who've come to the District of Columbia over time and loved it and enjoyed it. And they have representation. And so I don't know if there's a group that is working to outreach to people who've actually visited here, lived here, enjoyed this, who can start to educate their representatives about what the district is. And that's similar to what we were talking about earlier, about reaching out. We have a lot, even in this neighborhood, a lot of former Congress people who have some experience, and they know people who are still in Congress. And to the extent that we can educate them and have them become familiar with the district, I think at least it would make their acceptance of continuing this discrimination, would make it more difficult for them. But there are a lot of, people come and, I volunteer at one of the national museums, and they're impressed with Washington, how clean, how friendly, all the things that are available here. And so I think we can possibly reach out to people in other states who've had good experiences here and say, it's not a hellhole,
That's interesting. I wonder, it's a great thought. And I wonder what kind of mailing lists or other could, like, I don't know, DC tourism. I just don't know you know, who would have access to that kind of resource. But it's a great concept.
Margaret, I have to call you back on my Zoom call right now.
Yeah, Bill, are you raising your hand? Yeah.
Yeah, this iPhone, I don't see how to
It's
do
okay.
the
Don't-
little hand thing, anyway. I think as, maybe as early as this summer, but certainly, throughout this Trump's term, I think there will be massive demonstrations. I mean, Vera and I were literally here at the 68 demonstration. I think that, and Martin Luther King, I think it will pale to insignificance to the 1, 2, 3 million people that will end up down in the mall. That will be coming from all over the country. So maybe there's some way that we can support that effort by providing, I guess, at one end, housing.
Mhm.
And maybe the village could act as a clearinghouse of information. So we somehow reach out to the organizers of what I anticipate will be enormous protests, to those organizers, and say, this is who we are. If people need housing, or if they simply need a meal in our house, then to support these folks that are coming from around the country in any way that we can, not just emotionally, but practically, with a place to stay or a free meal.
That's a great idea.
Yeah.
What do others think of what's coming up? Yeah, Nan.
And
Oh,
Judy,
stand up
I
for
apologize.
science
Oh.
is it?
Whoops,
I'm sorry, wait, Nan, just 1 second. Jeff, you have to go?
Yeah, I do. I have to drop to a 3, but I'm happy to follow up with anybody. and
Okay.
Thank you.
All right. So if folks want to send questions, you can send questions to me, and I'm happy to forward them
Yeah,
to Jeff and
I'll
put
be
you in
available
touch.
to answer.
Yeah, Jeff, thank you so much
Thank
for the
you.
work
You're
that you're
welcome.
doing.
Oh, it's my
As
pleasure.
always,
Thank
I
you
really
all.
appreciate you being here.
Oh, it's my
All right.
honor. Thank you for having me.
Okay.
Thank you.
We'll
Thanks,
follow
Jeff.
up soon, Judy.
Okay. Bye. Any other
Stand up for
other-
science is going to be at the Lincoln Memorial.
Lincoln Memorial? Okay. All right.
Yeah. From 12 to 4.
Okay. One thing that I'm wondering, if folks, CHV has to, we have to be, yeah, this is can CHV. Yeah. So our nonprofit status is not really at risk for for doing lobbying or something like that. And as long as the work that we're doing is not candidate specific and nonpartisan, then we don't have any issues. However, I do feel like I want to be cautious about not promoting one political position over another as CHV, but I'm also committed to supporting members in whatever way that they want to organize. And so what that means to me is that I can't initiate something. I can't say, hey, everybody, let's form a movement. But if a member wants to form an affinity group of some kind and organize people who want to be involved in political activities or protests or things like that, I am more than happy to see CHV, list it, support it, help organize it the same way we would any other affinity group. So I hope, that, at the same time, what's that?
We should definitely do that. We'll have to figure out a way to do that. That would be a great activity within CHV.
Okay, well, if somebody is willing to be the coordinator, I'm sorry, if somebody's willing to be the coordinator, we can just start, you can put meetings on the calendar. We can set up a listserv through Village Talk, where you can share information just within the village, and the members of the group. So if there's anybody, like I said, anybody who wants to be involved in that kind of, just at a leadership level of being the one to say, hey, this is when we're going to meet, or this is what we're happy to organize that. I see Fran has her hand up, so I just want to honor that.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. I mean, I've been so following this, worried about DC. Think that there should be a group in Capitol Hill that's meeting to talk about this, and it makes sense to do it through the village. I would be happy, I live in the residences, I'd be happy to reserve us a room I do not want to be in the leadership of it. I mean,
Okay.
since I'm involved with a bunch of the other affinity groups, and I think doing it as an affinity group is a safe way to do it.
That's right.
A good way to do, easy way to do it, really easy. I
Yeah.
think it's a great idea.
It's an easy way to do it. And it also, it means that we can put information in the newsletter about it. Like I said, as long as it's not coming from me as the official representative of
Right.
Capitol Hill Village saying this is what we endorse, you
Right.
know, and it's really, it's pretty wide open.
Right. I also want to say it was just so great to hear about this from your colleague. It's really been an important talk for me.
I know that I felt an incredible amount of comfort. A few weeks ago, I listened in on a call that the ACLU was doing. And one of the things that they shared, of course, they filed a lawsuit within 2 hours of the birthright citizenship executive action. And the fact that they had been anticipating and preparing and planning based on the goals of Project 2025 just gave me the sense of like, yes, people are on it, and that's the same thing here. Like, I feel, we don't know if we're going to win, right? I mean, who knows what's going to happen? I mean, maybe Clarence Thomas will drop dead and, things will improve. Who knows? But
not with Trump as president.
No, I know. Well, Amy Coney Barrett has done,
Yes.
She's surprised me a little bit. So anyway, just anything's possible. But my point is that that I think just knowing that there are people working who have the skills and the knowledge on that piece of it just gave me a lot of comfort.
Right.
And then knowing that there are people like, Free DC organizing. Yeah.
Well, I was surprised that these prestigious law firms are involved with it.
Yes.
I think of them as being, I don't know, certainly not working on this. I'm just kind of blown away to think that they have provided this task. And Bill, you're agreeing with me. Wasn't that amazing to hear?
Well, that's the power of DC Appleseed. And I can say that because I used to work there, that they leverage the power of these large law firms to work on local public policy problems. And so the group that he's describing, I mean, that's that's the board, and that's what they're really good at. Yeah, go ahead. Oh, Bill, and then Shirley.
I'm certainly not an attorney. I've never played one on TV, but this whole concept that the village cannot be involved as a not-for-profit in explicitly political activities, I understand that, and you're 100% right. I'm sure a question for Jeffrey or maybe an attorney within the village membership. Could the village, because I read about these things, set up a independent political action committee?
Probably.
Yeah.
And that political action committee, by its very name, can do those kind of things that the not-for-profit cannot do.
Yeah.
You might want to ask around on that point.
Well, we probably could, and with a group of 500 people, anyway, I'm happy to look into it. I think it's a question for the board to answer.
Sure. Of course.
And
100%.
Chris is on the board, and maybe Chris will help at least facilitate that conversation. Yeah, I got
Okay.
a thumbs up.
But I have to go. Thank you. Thank you for the talk.
Thanks. And Shirley,
Yeah, I would.
Oh, and then Nan, I'm sorry. Yeah.
I was just going to say, along these lines, let's just, given what you said, I respect that. What about something, I was surprised to learn that we are disproportionately funded for Medicaid and possibly quite Medicare. What about an organization like AARP that's used to lobbying and pointing out that the citizens of the District of Columbia do not get the same level of funding for their medical expenses, and using them, they are a lobbying association, and they have some credence.
Yeah. Shirley, that's a great thought. We have a relationship with them, and they've been supportive of us in local public policy stuff. I think anybody at the village who's a member of AARP should reach out to AARP DC specifically and say, hey, this is something that's really important to us as older adults, and we would love your support on it. They have a mailing list of 15,000. which, you know, is a lot bigger than our mailing list, and I think could be a really powerful ally. So yeah, it's a great idea.
And I know.
Man,
There are already so many existing groups that we might end up duplicating a lot of work. So it might be better just to join Indivisible Waterfront or join Free DC or DC Statehood, and engage in those activities rather than trying to reinvent the wheel and start all over again.
I don't, you know, I don't think an affinity group has to be like reinventing anything. It's simply about coming together to talk about ideas and share information, like, you know, what is Indivisible doing? What is Free DC doing? Right. So that nobody feels like they, you know, because I think as individuals, you know, I think there's power in coming together, and I think there's relief in coming together. It's also the possibility of like knowing if you want to go to, say, the March on Science, like which of my neighbors can I call and go with me? You know, I think so it's that, it's not about, we're not going to be, I can't, I mean, of course, if the affinity group wanted to, they could do whatever they wanted, but I agree. I think there's plenty to tap into, but I also think that having an affinity group at CHV gives us the opportunity to share it among the population here. We have you know, our newsletter has a reach of 1,500, or close to 1,600. So if there was an article in the newsletter, you know, that would be powerful. Certainly our, you know, our digests, things going out and saying, hey, a group of us are going together to this particular activity. If anybody would like to join us, right? That could go out on the, you know, in weekly newsletters. So I think there's, you know, there's ways to connect with people through Capitol Hill Village that doesn't reinvent the wheel. Any other thoughts? Nobody has volunteered to be our point person for this, although we have a place to meet, but not a person. So maybe we'll just ask folks if you want to think about it a little bit, and maybe talk to some other affinity group leaders, you know, folks who have done it. They can, you know, share with you what, or, you know, you can certainly talk to me or Mary about what would be involved. You know, I think affinity groups are pretty much as much or as little as you want them to be. In terms of, they can be as, you know, they can be as little as a list, as an email list, if that's what works. So just knowing that just know that that's a possibility. My hope is that we can have more conversations like this with experts like Jeff.
Please, yes.
Yeah, I've been trying to line up our I guess what they call a shadow representative, Representative Oye, has offered to come. I just wasn't, he's the elected, he's the non-voting Senate representative. So I'm trying to line that up. But if you have any other thoughts about people you'd like to hear from, you know, I'm happy to help schedule those, make that information available. I'm also going to start sending out kind of some health information and other things that sort of are coming to me from various sources to try to help folks make sense of, you know, some of the changes that are going on. But
Okay.
all right. Well, listen, thank you. Thank you
This
all
was
for
great.
coming.
Thank you so much.
Really appreciate you all
Thanks so
being
much.
here, all your questions and everything. We'll see you soon.
Thank you.